In 1565, Spain planted a settlement at the edge of a Florida peninsula and called it St. Augustine. It was 42 years before Jamestown, 55 years before Plymouth. It is the oldest continuously inhabited European-founded city in the United States. And for one decade near the end of the 19th century, it was also the most fashionable winter address in the country. A Spanish colonial town of 14,000 people remade, at one man's expense, into a palace for the wealthiest families in America. The Vanderbilts came. The Rockefellers came. Presidents came south by private railroad car to sleep in a hotel said to have cost around $2.5 million, wired for electric light, finished in Tiffany glass, built of poured concrete over streets that were already 300 years old. Today that hotel is a college. The second grandest is a museum. The man who built them is entombed in the church he raised as a memorial to his daughter, in a city his railroad had already left behind. This is the story of how one Standard Oil fortune bought the oldest city in America, turned it into the grandest resort in the South, and then rode past it. Chapter 1. The Oldest City. But before any of that, St. Augustine had already been old for 3 centuries. On September 8, 1565, a Spanish admiral named Pedro Menendez de Aviles landed a fleet on the northeastern coast of the Florida peninsula and drove a stake into the ground. The settlement he founded that morning would become the capital of Spanish Florida, held by the crown for the better part of 200 years, administered by a succession of governors whose names have mostly dissolved into the colonial record. Menendez himself stayed only long enough to secure the position and map the coastline. The settlement remained. The town that grew from that landing was not built on any obvious resource. There was no gold, no silver, no navigable river pointing toward the interior. What St. Augustine had was location, a harbor on the Atlantic coast, close enough to the Gulf Stream to matter for ships moving north, close enough to the Caribbean to serve as a waypoint for the Spanish Empire, a garrison town, and little more. A place built to hold a coast, rather than to exploit a landscape. The fort came a century later. In 1672, the Spanish crown authorized construction of the Castillo de San Marcos, at the edge of the harbor, and the building material was the one nearest and most abundant, coquina. It is shell and sand compressed by time into something that barely qualifies as rock, soft enough to cut with a saw, porous, crumbling at the edges, the color of old cream. Quarried from Anastasia Island and floated across the harbor in flatboats, coquina built the Castillo over more than 2 decades. The fort was finished in 1695 and never fell. Coquina does not shatter under cannon fire. It absorbs the shot. Cannonballs simply buried themselves in the stone and stopped, and the wall remained. The Castillo de San Marcos became the oldest masonry fort in the continental United States, enduring not despite its humble material, but because of it. Spain held St. Augustine until 1763, when the city passed to Britain as part of the settlement ending the 7 Years' War. Britain held it for 20 years, then returned it to Spain in 1783. Spain held it again until 1821, when the Adams-Honest Treaty transferred Florida to the United States, and the Spanish flag came down over the Castillo for the last time. Spain, then Britain, then Spain again, then the United States by 1821. 4 flags over the same coquina walls, each new government inheriting the old streets and the old fort without fundamentally changing the place. By the 1880s, 60 years into American possession, St. Augustine was a town of some few thousand people living in a city built for a different civilization. The streets were narrow, laid out for the pace of a colonial garrison, rather than the traffic of a growing American port. The walls of the older buildings were still coquina, pocked, weathered, beautiful, in the way that old things can be beautiful when they have stopped serving their original purpose and started serving no purpose except to remain. A handful of tourists made the journey south each season, arriving by steamer or the slow rail connections that existed, staying in modest boarding houses, walking streets that felt, as more than one visitor remarked, like the streets of another country that had simply failed to leave. The town had everything a resort needed, except the infrastructure to become one. It had warmth. It had antiquity. It had the oldest fort in the country, standing over a harbor that had changed little in 200 years. And it had, in the coquina of its walls and parapets and old colonial houses, a building material that had outlasted the Spanish Empire, the British occupation, and 2 centuries of Atlantic weather. Quiet, absorbing whatever the years sent against it without breaking. It was waiting for money. Keep that coquina in mind. It will come back. Chapter 2. The Man from Standard Oil. Enter Henry Morrison Flagler. He was born in Hopewell, New York, in 1830, the son of a Presbyterian minister of modest means. And he left home at 14 with a handful of dollars and no particular inheritance, except an aptitude for commerce and a temperament built for systems. He worked grain sales in Ohio. He tried salt manufacturing in Michigan and lost what he had made. He came back to Ohio, found his way into a refining business with a quiet Cleveland merchant named John D. Rockefeller, and in 1870, together with a third partner, they incorporated the Standard Oil Company. Flagler was not a secondary figure in that arrangement. He drafted the partnership agreements. He negotiated the railroad rebates that gave Standard Oil its structural advantage over every competitor in the country. He was, by every reliable account, the man who turned Rockefeller's gift for discipline into an organization capable of holding an entire industry in a single fist. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled most of the oil refining in the United States. The precise share varied by year and by the definition of control, but the fact was not seriously contested. The company had assembled, through acquisition and pressure and a willingness to move faster than regulators or rivals could follow, something close to a monopoly over the processing and transport of American petroleum. Flagler's portion of that enterprise was a fortune with almost no rival in the country. He had spent the better part of 30 years building systems, refinery networks, pipeline routes, railroad contracts, and now the systems were built, and they ran largely without him. And he was 53 years old with more money than any reasonable project could require, and a question about what came next. He had first seen Florida in 1878, traveling south for reasons of health. He came again in 1883, on his honeymoon with his second wife, Ida Alice Showards. He was brought back to St. Augustine, still slow, still narrow-streeted, still running at the pace of a colonial town that had never quite decided what it wanted to be in the American century. He walked its streets and found what others had found: warmth in winter, antiquity in the stone, a harbor unchanged since the Spanish had built the Castillo at its edge. What he did not find was a hotel, not the kind that could hold the people he already knew, the names from the club cars and the railroad meetings, the families whose fortunes had accumulated in the same decades and by the same methods as his own. A man building something large begins by identifying what is missing. What was missing from St. Augustine was not warmth or history or the quality of winter light off the harbor. It was the infrastructure of prestige. The physical plant that would tell the right people this was a place designed to receive them. Flagler understood, from 30 years of assembling industrial systems, that the infrastructure was not supplementary to the product. It was the product. Build the hotel first, at a scale that makes the town subordinate to it. Then the town becomes the setting, and the guests come because the guests are already there. He decided to build a hotel, not a boarding house, not a modest winter lodge, but something that would redefine what a resort in the American South could mean. In a town of a few thousand people, on a peninsula most Americans had never visited, in a city that had been quietly fading for 60 years since the Spanish left. He would build a palace. More precisely, he decided to buy the idea of an entire city and rebuild it from the center outward. The hotel was the first move. The railroad and the waterworks and the churches were the moves that followed. The decision that contained all the others was made on the streets of St. Augustine in 1883 by a man who had spent his life building things and had run out of industrial systems left to build. The town that had been waiting for money now had the money, walking its streets. Chapter 3. The Palace of Poured Concrete. The building began in 1885. Flagler did not go to the established firms. He did not engage the men who had built the grand hotels of Newport or Saratoga. He went instead to two young New York architects named John Carrere and Thomas Hastings, who were in their late 20s, who had trained together at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and who had not yet built anything of consequence in the United States. The Hotel Ponce de Leon would be their first major commission, and it launched one of the great American architecture firms of the next half-century. In 1885, they were untested, and Flagler hired them anyway. The style they chose was Spanish Renaissance Revival, a deliberate echo of the colonial city around it. The arched loggias and terracotta detail and warm ochre walls that gestured toward the civilization that had built the Castillo and the old garrison streets. The hotel did not impose itself on the oldest city in America. It claimed to belong to it. The construction method was something else entirely. The Ponce de Leon was the first large building in the United States constructed entirely of poured concrete. The aggregate mixed into that concrete was coquina, the same soft shellstone quarried from Anastasia Island that the Spanish had used to raise the Castillo de San Marcos 2 centuries before. The same material, the same island. The stone that had absorbed British cannonballs and refused to shatter was now ground and mixed and poured into the molds of a Gilded Age palace on the same streets the Spanish garrison had walked. The fort and the hotel were made in the most literal sense of the same thing. The coquina had come back. The doors opened on January 10th, 1888. What guests entered that morning was unlike anything then standing in the American South. The hotel rose 4 stories over a footprint occupying nearly an entire city block, its towers visible from the harbor, its central courtyard open to the Florida sky. Inside, the ceilings of the dining room and the principal public spaces carried the stained glass and painted surfaces of Louis Comfort Tiffany, whose firm had been commissioned for the interiors. Tiffany's windows here, in a hotel on the Florida coast, in a city of a few thousand people, in a building that had not existed 3 years before. And there was electricity. From its first night, the Ponce de Leon was lit entirely by electric light, among the first hotels in the country to offer this at a time when most American buildings still ran on gas. The generators said to have powered the system were connected, by some accounts, to Flagler's friend Thomas Edison. Whether Edison personally designed or supervised the electrical plant is not established. What is established is that the hotel glowed from the night it opened. With a light that most of its guests had never seen inside a building before, electric light in 1888 was not a convenience. It was a spectacle. The whole project is said to have cost around $2.5 million. $2.5 million in a coastal town whose permanent population numbered in the low thousands, in a state with fewer than 400,000 residents total. Not a $2.5 million investment in a major northern city. A $2.5 million hotel in St. Augustine, Florida, in 1888, in a market that had to be invented at the same time the building went up. The math was not practical. It was a declaration. The most modern luxury in America, poured concrete, electric light, Tiffany glass, set down in the oldest city in the country. A building technique that had never been attempted at this scale, inside a city founded 323 years before its doors opened. The Ponce de Leon opened to immediate acclaim, and within its first full season, it was already the most luxurious hotel in the South. The crowd it was designed for was on its way. Chapter 4. The Winter Newport. The Ponce de Leon filled within its first season. It filled so completely, and with the kind of guest who did not accept apology or insufficient accommodation, that Flagler understood before the season was out that one hotel, however large, however finished, was not going to be enough. He did not wait long. In December 1888, less than 12 months after the Ponce de Leon had opened across the street, the Hotel Alcazar accepted its first guests. The two buildings faced each other across King Street, the new hotel a lower, lighter counterpart to the first, built for leisure, where the Ponce de Leon had been built for grandeur. The Alcazar held steam baths and a gymnasium, a casino, a ballroom, and one of the largest indoor swimming pools in the country. It was not supplementary to the first hotel. It was its social complement, the place where guests moved when the formal atmosphere of the Ponce de Leon required relief. He then acquired a third. A businessman named Franklin Smith had constructed a Moorish revival building under the name Casa Monica, and it had not found its footing on its own. Flagler bought it and reopened it as the Cordova, bringing it into his operation. 3 hotels within a few blocks of one another, 3 addresses, 1 owner. The infrastructure of prestige that Flagler had decided to build in 1883 was now physically present. Word traveled, as Flagler had always understood it would, through the social networks of the very people he had built for. St. Augustine became known as the Winter Newport, the cold season capital of the American elite. The address that Newport, Rhode Island served in summer, now serving Florida in the months when the northern cities went gray. The Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers came south for the season, the men from the steel mills and the oil refineries arriving by private car, detached from the northbound expresses and left on sidings in the St. Augustine yards, while their occupants settled into rooms that the continent's best architects had designed for exactly this purpose. Senators came, industrialists came, heirs of the rail fortunes came. For a few winters in the early 1890s, the oldest city in America was also its most fashionable address. But hotels required a town capable of receiving them, and the old Spanish city had not been built with that expectation. Flagler understood this with the same systematic clarity that had made him useful to Standard Oil. He paid for waterworks. He paid for paved streets to replace the sandy lanes the colonial grid had left behind. He funded an electric plant, a hospital, a city hall. He built churches. Among them, in 1889, he raised the Memorial Presbyterian Church, designed in Venetian Renaissance style, its dome visible from the harbor, built in memory of his daughter, who had died that year. Flagler built it to hold his grief and named it for what he had lost. Keep that church in mind. The result was something that had not existed anywhere in Florida before. The old Spanish town of narrow coquina walls and garrison streets had been remade, at one man's expense and within 5 or 6 years, into a Gilded Age stage set. He had not simply built buildings in St. Augustine. He had purchased the condition of the place and replaced it with something else. The waterworks were his. The electric plant was his. The streets the private carriages moved along had been paved with his money. In every practical sense, Flagler owned the town, not by deed, but in the way that a man owns a thing when his money is the sole reason it exists in its present form. Picture St. Augustine at the height of the winter season, perhaps 1892. The Ponce de Leon towers are lit against the evening sky with electric light, a spectacle for guests accustomed to gas and candlelight. The Alcazar's pool is full. The Cordova's dining room is set. The streets, once the sandy colonial lanes of a garrison, are paved and ordered, built for the pace of resort life. Private rail cars sit in the yards a few blocks away. A city founded in 1565, sleeping through most of the American century, was now, for a few months each year, the brightest room in the country. The season would not last, but the railroad was still pointing north. Chapter 5. The Railroad and the Season. The hotels were built. The crowd was coming. What Flagler now needed was a way to deliver it. St. Augustine in the late 1880s was not easily reached. The rail connections that existed were slow, patchwork, and undercapitalized. A collection of small, independent lines laid across Florida without any coordinating logic beyond the ambitions of whoever had obtained the charter. A traveler coming south from New York or Philadelphia might change trains twice, wait hours on unheated platforms, and arrive in a condition that made the idea of a grand resort feel faintly absurd. Flagler had spent 30 years building systems. He recognized a broken one, so he began to buy. He acquired the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax River Railway in 1885. He acquired the St. Augustine and Palatka Railway, then the St. John's Railway, then turned his attention to the lines north of Jacksonville, welding the separate properties into a single continuous route, standard gauge maintained to his specifications, with equipment capable of carrying the private cars that constituted, for the very wealthy, the only acceptable way to travel. The result was the beginning of what would become the Florida East Coast Railway, with St. Augustine as its northern anchor, its operating headquarters, its administrative center. The top of a line that, in the early 1890s, still ended within a few miles of where it began. The town now had a hotel empire and a railroad, both pointing at the same idea: bring the wealthy of the North to the warmth of the South. Picture St. Augustine on an evening in the winter season of the early 1890s. King Street at dusk, the air cool and salt-edged off the harbor, the last light going pink over the Matanzas. The Ponce de Leon is lit, not candlelit, not gaslit, electrically lit, every window burning with a steadiness that natural fire cannot hold, its two towers glowing above streets whose oldest stones were already old when George Washington was born. For many of the guests stepping down from the private cars in the yards on the west side of town, this is the first time they have seen electric light inside a building. They have read about it. They have perhaps seen it demonstrated. Here it is a fact, applied to an entire palace, applied to the towers of a Spanish Renaissance Revival hotel on a street the colonial garrison walked in 1600. The Alcazar is full across King Street, its steam baths running, its pool occupied by men and women whose names appear in the social columns of the New York papers as a matter of course. The Cordova's dining room is set, 3 hotels, within a few blocks of one another, serving a clientele that has arrived in its own rolling stock and will depart the same way. A city that was, a decade ago, a half-abandoned colonial backwater, its streets sandy, its coquina buildings crumbling gently into the subtropical heat, its sole distinction the age of what it had failed to demolish, is now, for these few winter weeks each year, the most fashionable address in America. 3 centuries old and newly the most fashionable. The dissonance of that fact sat in the warm, electric air of King Street, and no one remarked on it. They rarely do when things are at their peak. The season ran from late December through March, and in those months the Florida East Coast Railway organized its schedules around the rhythms of the resort rather than the rhythms of commerce. Private cars were attached and detached on the sidings. The names that filled the hotel registers, the dynasties of steel, oil, and rail, arrived for the warmth and stayed for the company, which was the same company they kept in Newport in summer, transported entire to the Florida coast. For a few years in the early 1890s, the social logic of American wealth had a winter address, and the address was St. Augustine. The railroad that made the season possible was also in its own structure the instrument that could end it. A line built to deliver guests to one destination carries within it the mechanism for delivering them to another. Flagler knew this. He had known it since the first survey. The line stopped at St. Augustine because it had not yet been extended. Keep that in mind. Chapter 6. The railroad goes south. And then, very quietly, the line kept moving. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement that the arrangement in St. Augustine had changed. The Florida East Coast Railway simply continued south, the way railroads continue when the man who owns them decides the next station matters more than the last. In 1894, Flagler extended his line to Palm Beach, a barrier island on the southeastern coast, with winters so mild they made St. Augustine feel, by comparison, provisional. He built a hotel there to match the latitude. The Royal Poinciana opened on the shores of Lake Worth. Billed as the largest wooden building in the world, a claim no structure in the South could contest. Later, he added the resort called the Breakers on the ocean side. Palm Beach became what St. Augustine had been. The winter of 1894 and 1895 gave Flagler a reason to go further. A freeze moved down the peninsula that season and destroyed much of the state's citrus crop. Groves that had taken years to establish, lost in a few nights of temperature, growers had not prepared for. The freeze spared the far south. By legend, a landowner named Julia Tuttle sent Flagler a cutting of orange blossoms to prove it. Proof that the frost had not reached Biscayne Bay. Proof that another 100 miles of rail would find a climate untouched. She offered him land. In 1896, the first train reached a small settlement on the bay. Flagler helped lay it out, built the Royal Palm Hotel on the waterfront, and the city that grew there became Miami. Julia Tuttle is remembered as its mother. Flagler is the man who brought the railroad to her door. Then came the last and largest gamble. In 1905, the United States announced it would build the Panama Canal, and Flagler understood what that meant for the port at the tip of the peninsula. Key West was the closest major American harbor to the canal's Atlantic entrance. The line would have to finish there. The problem was that Key West sat on an island, and between the mainland and that island lay 128 miles of open water, shallow bays, and nothing resembling solid ground. Flagler built across it anyway, a series of bridges and concrete viaducts, 7 years of labor, a workforce that numbered in the thousands and was reduced by hurricanes, disease, and the ordinary hazards of construction on open water. The Oversea Railroad was completed in 1912. Flagler, past 80 and nearly blind, rode the first train into Key West. St. Augustine watched each extension from a distance it could not close. Every mile south drew the fashionable crowd further from the city that had briefly held them. Palm Beach pulled the season one way. Miami pulled it further. The Keys made the argument final. A guest who could ride Flagler's own railroad to a resort on the warm Atlantic in January had no particular reason to stop at the first resort on the line. Not unless the first was still the best, and Flagler himself had built better ones further south. The Ponce de Leon's towers were still lit. The Alcazar's baths were still running. The private cars still detached in the yards on the west side of town. But the private cars began to pause in St. Augustine the way a train pauses at a waypoint. Briefly, without the settled attention of people who have arrived where they intend to stay. The town that had been the destination had become the stop before somewhere warmer. Resort economies end this way. Not all at once, but by degrees. Each new property south of the last tilting the calculus, each season drawing the crowd a little further from the place that first drew it. St. Augustine had been the queen of American winter resorts for a single decade. That decade was already closing before the Royal Poinciana had held its first full season, before the first train reached Miami, before a spike of the oversea railroad had been driven into coral. The city had been made at one man's expense and remade in the same direction his railroad was already pointing. The railroad pointed south. The season followed. Chapter 7. The Fall of the House of Flagler. The empire was still growing when the man who built it began to come apart. By the early 1900s, Flagler's railroad had pushed past Palm Beach and into Miami, the ambition that had driven him south showing no sign of exhaustion. But behind the grand hotels, something else was unraveling. His second wife, Ida Alice Showards Flagler, had been confined to a sanitarium years earlier, declared insane and institutionalized. The woman who had accompanied him to Florida in 1883 on the honeymoon from which the whole enterprise had grown. She remained confined. She remained, under Florida law, his wife. Flagler changed the law. In 1901, he had the Florida legislature pass an act making incurable insanity a statutory ground for divorce, a change so precisely tailored to his circumstances, arriving so quickly after he required it, that it was widely understood, in Florida and well beyond, to have been purchased. The law passed. The divorce followed. 10 days after the decree was finalized, Flagler married Mary Lily Keenan in a ceremony at her family home in Kenansville, North Carolina. The house he built for his new wife was not in St. Augustine. It was not near the hotels and churches and paved streets he had raised there. It was in Palm Beach. Whitehall, the marble mansion on the shores of Lake Worth, was completed in 1902. He had loved St. Augustine first. He had moved past it anyway. He completed the Oversea Railroad in 1912. On May 20th, 1913, Henry Morrison Flagler fell down the marble stairs at Whitehall. He was 83. He died from his injuries that same day, in the mansion he had built for a wife who would outlive him, in the city he had chosen over the city he had made. His body was carried north along the railroad he had assembled from broken segments and sheer force of capital. It was returned to St. Augustine. And in that city, in the Memorial Presbyterian Church, with its Venetian Renaissance dome visible across the harbor, built in 1889 in memory of his daughter, Flagler was entombed. He had raised the church to hold his grief when grief was what he had. Now it held him. He lies there beside his daughter, Jenny Louise, for whom the church had been named. He lies there beside his first wife, Mary Harkness. The church he had built for one loss became the repository of all of them, and the town he had remade stood around it, beautiful, expensive, and increasingly quiet. And with him gone, the thing he had held together by proximity to power began, quietly, to loosen. The elite who had come to St. Augustine had come in the first instance because Flagler had made it the place to come. The social logic of American wealth had never been fixed to this latitude specifically. It had been fixed to Flagler's attention, his infrastructure, his habit of building the next, better thing in the next warmer place. Palm Beach had drawn the season south. Miami had drawn it further. St. Augustine, which had held it first, had been losing it longest. What remained now was the form without the animating force. The hotels were still there. The poured concrete towers, the Tiffany windows, the steam baths, the indoor pool. All of it still intact, still staffed, still open in season. But the season shrank, not in any single winter that could be named, but by degrees. The bookings thinner each year. The private cars pausing in the St. Augustine yards for shorter intervals. The Alcazar's ballroom hosting smaller assemblies. A city engineered around a single purpose was discovering how fragile a single purpose is. There was no second act written into the architecture. There was only the architecture itself, standing in the Florida sun, waiting for a season that kept arriving a little lighter than the one before. The Depression and the hotel closures it would bring were still a decade away. But the direction was already clear. The railroad still ran through the yards on the west side of town. The church on the harbor still held its dead. The crowd was somewhere else. Chapter 8, The Empty Palaces. The Depression arrived the way the slow collapse of a resort economy always does. Not as a rupture, but as a confirmation. What had been thinning for a decade finally stopped altogether. The Hotel Alcazar closed its doors in 1931. The steam baths went cold. The ballroom, where the winter season had once ended its last night of dancing, stood silent in the Florida heat, its floor unpolished, its chandeliers still. The Cordova had already closed by then, the earliest of Flagler's 3 St. Augustine hotels, to concede what the ledger had been saying for years. The Ponce de Leon held on, not because it was thriving, but because it was too large and too grand for its management to accept, in any single season, that the season would not improve. It operated at a fraction of the capacity it had been designed to fill, its corridors long and its guest lists short. By mid-century, St. Augustine held what one man's fortune had left behind. The poured concrete towers still rose over King Street. The Tiffany glass still caught the Florida light in the Ponce de Leon's dining room. The marble, the gold leaf, the Spanish Renaissance Revival facades, the indoor pool of the Alcazar, all of it intact, all of it built for a decade of winters that had ended 40 years before. Flagler had designed the town as a stage set for the very wealthy and had built it to a standard they required. The problem was that it had lasted past its purpose. The buildings survived not by staying hotels, but by becoming something else. Not by restoration, not by any particular plan, by the slow improvisation of institutions that needed a building and found themselves facing structures too substantial to demolish and too large to ignore. The Alcazar sat shuttered through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, waiting for a buyer with sufficient ambition to match the scale of the thing. In 1947, that buyer arrived. Otto Leitner, a Chicago publisher who had made his fortune in the hobby press, purchased the Alcazar and deeded it to the city. The steam baths, where Gilded Age millionaires had taken the waters, became gallery space. The ballroom and the casino were absorbed into a museum of Victorian-era decorative arts. Leitner's own collection, accumulated over decades, now displayed in the rooms where the collection's original owners might have spent their winters. The baths held the era's possessions now. The city hall moved in alongside. It is the kind of irony that does not announce itself. It simply settles. The Ponce de Leon closed as a hotel in 1967, not with drama, not with a final season to which the newspapers paid particular attention, but with the administrative finality of an institution that had run the calculation one last time and arrived at a number that did not work. In 1968, it reopened as the heart of Flagler College, founded by Lawrence Lewis, Flagler's grandnephew. The rooms that had held the very wealthy held students now. The dining hall, where fortunes had maintained their winter social obligations, served meals to undergraduates beneath the same Tiffany windows. Windows that Louis Comfort Tiffany had designed in the 1880s, never removed, never sold, because the poured concrete walls holding them had stood for 80 years and would stand for 80 more. Students walked the same corridors. They lived, without ceremony, inside a building designed for a clientele of a very different kind, and the building absorbed them the way coquina absorbs a cannonball, taking the impact without cracking. The grandest resort hotel of the American South survived because it stopped being a hotel, not because the architecture was preserved by legislation, not because a philanthropy maintained it as a monument, but because an institution needed a building, and the building was there and good enough, solid enough, large enough, durable enough to be repurposed into something that could pay its own way. Flagler had built to impress. What he had actually built was something that could outlast every purpose he had imagined for it. The Ponce de Leon's towers still rise over King Street. The Tiffany windows still hold their color in the morning light. The students eating beneath them are not thinking about Henry Flagler. They have no particular reason to. Chapter 9. What Remains? The Cordova was the last to come back. It had served as a county courthouse for decades, that particular American afterlife for a building too large to demolish and too solid to let fall. A government office moving into rooms designed for leisure, filing cabinets standing where cocktail trolleys once stood. In 1997, a hotelier named Richard Kessler purchased the building for $1.2 million. He spent 2 years on the restoration, working around the original bones Flagler had built and Franklin Smith had conceived. In 1999, it reopened as the Casa Monica. The name returned to the building it had started with, before Flagler bought it and renamed it and folded it into his empire. Of the 3 grand hotels Flagler raised within a few blocks of one another in St. Augustine, the Casa Monica is the only one still taking guests. The Ponce de Leon holds students. The Alcazar holds the era's own possessions. Only the Cordova, the smallest of the 3, the one that had closed first and waited longest, came back to the use it was built for. The other 2 did not fail to survive. They simply survived as something else. Flagler's true monument was never St. Augustine. He had understood this, or something like it, even while he was building the place. The town was always the proof of concept, the first version of an idea that required a larger canvas. The Florida East Coast Railway was the monument. It opened the eastern coast of a state that had been, for most of American history, the end of the map. A peninsula too hot, too insect-ridden, too far from the centers of commerce to develop on its own. The railroad changed the calculation. It strung Palm Beach and Miami and Key West along a single steel line, connecting them to each other and to the north, and in doing so it built the modern geography of Florida. The cities Flagler funded, the cities his railroad made accessible, and his hotels made fashionable, became the economic center of the state. St. Augustine was where he learned how. Palm Beach was where he applied what he had learned. Miami was where the experiment became permanent. Key West was where he stopped because the land ran out. St. Augustine was the prototype. The city he built to understand what building a city required and then outgrew. Today it is a heritage town of about 14,000 people, and it holds 2 pasts simultaneously, not in sequence, not in separate districts, but layered on top of each other in the same streets. The Spanish colonial city of 1565 and the Gilded Age resort of the 1880s exist side by side, sold together to the tourists who come each year in numbers that would have astonished Pedro Menendez de Aviles and confused Henry Flagler equally. The Castillo de San Marcos still stands in Coquina at the edge of the harbor, its walls the same color they have always been. The old cream of shell and compressed sand, porous and absorbing, unchanged since the last stone was set in 1695. Each winter, the old streets fill with light for the season. The city calls the nights of lights, the colonial lanes strung with lanterns, the tourists moving through a place that has outlasted every version of itself. The 2 ages sit together without explanation, the fort built to hold a coast and the palace built to hold a season. The Spanish garrison walls, low and coquina pale, cut from Anastasia Island and floated across the harbor by men working for a crown that no longer exists. The poured concrete towers of the Ponce de Leon, rising over King Street in the Spanish Renaissance Revival style, that Carrere and Hastings designed when they were young enough that no one had yet tested whether they knew what they were doing. And those towers are still there. The concrete still sound after 135 years, students now crossing the courtyards where the Gilded Age elite once circulated. The fort outlasted the Spanish Empire. The college outlasted the hotel. The city outlasted the man who thought he owned it. What remains is this: The old coquina walls by the water, pale and quiet in the harbor light, absorbing the years the way they absorbed the cannonballs. Without breaking, without recording the impact in any way visible from the outside. And behind them, a few blocks inland, the concrete towers of a Standard Oil fortune, still standing over a town that has found other reasons to exist. One man arrived with a railroad and a plan, and remade 3 centuries of history into a single brilliant season. The season ended. The coquina remained. It has a talent for that.